Thank you so much. Hello, Kansas. So how many, excuse me, Kansas City. Obviously, I've got the Missouri side making noise over here. All right, so it seems like we're all familiar here. I feel like I know everybody, but Daryl said that there was a lot of you that didn't know who I am or what I do. So I'll give you a little bit of background on where I come from, on the perspective of the awe and wonder that atheists experience. I was raised not as indoctrinated as many of my friends who were former Christians. I was a Christian once upon a time, but I wasn't as heavily indoctrinated as most of the other people were. My family fortunately held to the idea that you don't indoctrinate a child until they reach what they call the age of reason, which they arbitrarily decided would be 8 years old. Now there's an old Jesuit saying that you give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man. So that shows you the strength of indoctrination. And my family fortunately did not do that to me. And I think they just assumed that everybody would expect, where everybody would believe in creationism. They didn't think they had to teach me anything about not believing in evolution. So on my 8th birthday, I remember my mother coming into the room with a Bible and telling me that this is the absolute truth in the Word of God and all like that. And I remember my first response to that being, no, it isn't. See what it says here? Which was a horrifying thing for them. Now, I was required to read that first 3 chapters that day on my 8th birthday, which I have to give a report to my mom about it. And I remember that the only way I could possibly interpret this would be as a parable, because obviously the eating of the fruit of the tree of life versus eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, these are clearly not wooden trees. You wouldn't be able to cut either one of these down and build a house out of it. This is a parable. This means continue on as you are, and you'll remain this way forever. But if you start seeking wisdom or whatever, then you can never go back to that childlike innocence again. This is the way I interpreted it. My family was horrified. Especially when I went further into it. Like, why was it Eve's fault? Were we talking to people in Bronze Age, in the Middle East, who often believed that women didn't have a soul, much less intelligence. So how are you going to, it would be like the Old West thing, looks like in the Wild Wild West I was taught as a kid that men went to the Wild West and it was all guns and shootouts and all of this, but then women showed up and suddenly you had people putting their guns away and walking down the street safely or whatever. So women are now being credited with having brought civilization in. So I'm thinking maybe that's what they're blaming women for in this story, and this is a parable for that. That you come out of this childhood environment, and now you know right from wrong, and now you have some sense of morality or what have you, and they're blaming that on the woman. They have treat it like it's a bad thing, and it's not even her idea because she couldn't have had an idea, so it has to be blamed on somebody else, and that's why they come up with a talking snake. And obviously, any story, as we understand it, if the story involves witches and wizards and dragons and magic spells or enchantments and curses and talking animals that act and think like human beings, there's a word for that. It's called fairy tale. We understand that's not a real story, right? So there's got to be a parable. There's got to be a moral to it. That's the purpose of a fairy tale, is that there's a moral to the story. So this is how I interpret it. Everybody else in my family, everybody else I knew throughout the entirety of my childhood believed in the Bible as literally true. They didn't talk about it. It wasn't prevalent in their lives. It's just something that they accepted. And one of the advantages that I had was, like a lot of other kids, I was interested in animals. I wanted to be a zoologist or something like that, like a lot of other kids did. One of my second grade teachers recognized that I was into dinosaurs and all like that, prehistoric animals in particular, and so she gave me a book on dinosaurs. And that book had a cladogram, which is a phylogenetic tree. It's like a just drawing of the tree of life, and it shows how all the animals are related. And I remember looking at that thinking, well, that makes perfect sense. Right? We can tell that, it's like the Sesame Street game of one of these things is not like the other. You look at the dog and the cat and the sheep, which one's different? This is pretty much how classification of animals works. And so this made sense to me, and that's why I objected so much when I was told that all of this was completely arbitrary, that God just randomly made 43 species of parrots, as Monty Python put it, where they're not related somehow. Now they want to come up with, the creationists now want to come up with something called kinds or Barrowmans or some other kind of excuse to try to get out to, but these are related, but only up to a point, and then they can't decide what that point is. Anyway, the people that I was raised with or raised by, absolutely every one of them believed, for example, in Noah's flood. I met one adult when I was 14 who didn't believe in Noah's flood. So this is how I was outnumbered. I was never a creationist myself, but I was the only person that I knew that even understood what evolution was, much less accepted it. The people in my life had no respect for scientists. Scientists were people with strange accents and crazy white hair who had ridiculous inventions that defied the laws of physics. That's what a scientist was. This is when everybody made fun of nerds and called them Poindexter or some such thing. And they would like to criticize scientists, saying scientists don't know everything. According to scientists, bumblebees can't even fly. Because nobody wants to read anything having to do with academic accuracy. They don't care about the scholarship. They just want to know that smart people are stupid. Because, professing to be wise, they became fools. That's a wonderful phrase, if you're a fool and doomed to stay that way. And you want to think that, God will undo the wisdom of the wise, so that because people in this kind of mental limitation have to be able to imagine that maybe somehow they're smarter than everybody else. This is the way I saw it, anyway, when I was growing up. So, the whole thing about the bumblebee flying, by the way, there was one guy who really, I have to say, kind of probably was a bit of an idiot. He thought that bumblebees flap their wings straight up and down like this, because he didn't look at it closely. And he didn't realize that the spine of the wing is on the front and how the trail edge, what the motion that would actually have to come from that. So he'd said, accordingly, he couldn't figure it out. So he's admitting that he can't figure it out. That means that science, all of science, every scientist everywhere can't figure out how a bumblebee flies, that they all said it's impossible because one guy can't figure it out. That's the only scholarship they have on that. Then somebody with a high-speed camera zooms in on it, and you see that the bees actually fluctuate their wings. So yeah, of course, science can explain how the bumblebee flies, but people didn't want to hear that. So I was raised to be credulous. I was raised to be gullible. I was told that skeptics were cynics who miss out on the big picture that only believers can understand. And all of our music reinforces this. Don't stop believing, hold on to that feeling. How much music do we have that's like that, right? You ever hear a song that celebrates skepticism? Right? I'd like to hear a song about nobody's fool or what a fool believes, and then talk about that. Because let's understand what a fool is. I think in the popular understanding, the popular parlance, we understand that a fool is someone who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence, right? So is it any surprise that the Bible and the Quran both give the opposite definition of what a fool is? Because those books are written to fool you. So I was raised to believe everything required to be a Ghostbuster. Remember the scene in the movie where Janine says, and I got it copied down here, do you believe in UFOs, astral projections, mental telepathy, ESP, clairvoyance, spirit photography, telekinetic movement, full trance mediums, the Loch Ness Monster, and the theory of Atlantis? When I was 19, I bragged that I believed in all these things. Because somehow, being credulous is a virtue. How does that work? I'm stupid, I'm gullible, I don't think about the things that I'm told. I just believe them wholeheartedly, without question. How is that a virtue? But this is what people want to manipulate you. They want you to be unquestioning in your obeisance to their rules. Now, I always had a scientific bent, even though it wasn't encouraged by anyone in my family. I wanted to experiment with things. I wanted to understand things. I remember, for example, that when I was 12, I was given books, not science books. I was given Erich von Däniken, Chariots of the Gods, for example, right, where they have the Nazca lines in South America, where time-traveling astronauts have created runways for themselves. Anybody familiar with this story? No? Okay. And then what was the other one? Erich von Däniken and it was Chariots of the Gods. I can't remember the other one now, but there's another ridiculous. Oh no. Immanuel Velikovsky, the story that he came up with the idea that Jupiter gave birth to Venus, and they played interplanetary pinball with the planet Venus as it goes around all these different planets. It creates weird effects on Earth, so that this somehow creates all of the illusions or the experiences that we had in the Exodus, for example. This is how desperate they are to rationalize the belief system, that they make up all of this unsupported nonsense with the planets. And now, of course, I saw Carl Sagan explain how Velikovsky was full of, I don't know, Sawdust. The kids still in the room? Yeah, so I've been taught to misunderstand science and not to respect science at all. And so I'm told all these ridiculous parodies of what it is that scientists believe until I finally saw Cosmos. And so I heard the stories about why, how scientists think that the universe erupted from a single point. And when you think about people who live in a trailer explaining to you science, you're obviously not going to get the most academically precise description, right? So this is the kind of environment that I was raised in. And as I said, there's no respect for the scholarship. They don't want to understand. As a matter of fact, they want intentionally to not understand. But I get to see Cosmos, and I understand, and people, and he's explaining, and now I have an idea. And accurate information has practical application. It's what you know, what you can show, what you can work with. And so it's frustrating to me when people like Oprah say that atheists can't experience awe or wonder. It bothers me because I remember my father telling me that he didn't like movies anymore. Why do you like movies? He says, well, that's just a story somebody made up. I get that. I get that. See, like, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a trilobite. My necklace here is a trilobite. I think it's a fossil that was given me by my professor of paleontology. And I think it's terribly impressive that this is a minimum of 250 million years old. It's a ridiculous number, it seems, but it's also a real number. We've got ways of showing this. But this means more to me than saying that it's 11 jillion years old, because that's not a meaningful number. It's just made up. Or saying that this is a scarab with magical powers, or that it's eternal, so that I can avoid the burden of proof that the believers so detest. And remember Genesis 30, when Jacob thought that if cattle mate inside of striped sticks, that they would bear striped calves, right? This is in the Bible. How is this useful information, right? This is God showing how wrong he is. He doesn't understand genetics. And so we've been using, this obviously doesn't work. This method doesn't work. So we've been using selective breeding practices throughout agriculture using evolutionary principles. It would have been handy if we understood evolutionary principles. Maybe the Bible should have given us that, right? This is another thing to be impressed by, how things can work, how you can if you understand the way things really work, that you can really work them. There's a positive benefit, right? It's so much more meaningful for me to see things as they are than the way that they're told to me in stories when the story doesn't have any external value. Once upon a time, clouds, smoke, and the movement of breath, or the wind, or the evaporation of alcohol, which you can see, everybody look out in the bottle, you can see the distortion as you come out. These were all thought to be literally spirit. The idea that primitive people had about where their spirit comes from this. They're looking at clouds and everything. They're looking at dust devils, for example. Why they're called dust devils? They were literally thought to be devils. And this is where the idea of the jinn come from. What a genie is, what we recognize in the West as a genie, in the Arabic world, that would be the jinn. And these were literally dust devils, because they would rise up out of the ground and throw your tents around and things like that. So those are definitely devils. This is what they're thinking. Because they want to imagine that someone is doing everything rather than something. Right? Because everything has intent. Comets were an omen, and the movement of the planets were thought to have personality, because anything that moves, anything that does anything, has to be because somebody wanted that to happen. Diseases were the curses of witchcraft. Epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession. And tornadoes and volcanoes were the gods themselves. Now, in each case, we realized that the explanation that religion was giving us was wrong, and we can't do anything with that. And in each case, when we discovered what the real explanation was, it was a revelation of whole new fields of study that were vastly more complex than the ideas we originally had, which is far more interesting than any of the supernatural excuses that people would make up. And for example, one of the biggest arguments, or the most common arguments that you get when you're arguing with creationists or religious believers in general, is we can't explain the origin of life. We can't explain everything about the origin of life, but we know a whole lot about it. And the more we know about it, the more fascinating it is. There's never going to be a point where it would even be interesting that God went poof and there was life. But when you look at endosymbiosis, how all of our cells have acquired acquired and employ bacterial cells, mitochondria, which start from rickettsia bacteria. I think it's fascinating that our cells are integrated with bacterial cells. So we're not entirely human, we're half bacteria, or some good proportion of bacteria. Right? We can't even digest without bacteria. We are inefficient machines without bacteria. So we are a conglomerate life form. The chemical conditions of self-replicating materials where under a repeating set... What was that? Am I out of time? 10 minutes, okay. The chemical conditions that we've seen for the origin of life, I mean, various different aspects of the origin of life, like how these replicative polymers can become increasingly complex over a repeated sequence of irradiation and inundation and dehydration, becoming increasingly complex until you get to the right point and you add a phosphate and boom, it spontaneously creates ribonucleotide polymers. I think that's fascinating. Other people, I'm sure, want to imagine somebody in a dress with wings, but that doesn't appeal to me. I think there's more awe and wonder in looking at the vastness of the cosmos than trying to imagine that we are the center of it or the origin of it, because the Bible says that the earth was the first thing ever created. Right? So our universe, or our planet, and I've actually met people who believe this, by the way. There are people that were in my family that believe this, that the earth was not only the center of the universe, but the biggest thing in it. So that all the planets and the stars are in concentric circles around ours. And I can't remember when this comes from. Like somebody, I think that this was given up in the 1600s, but there are people in my family that still buy into this. And more, I meet people who hold to geocentrism, who now hold to flat Earth. How is that possible? One of the things that we're seeing, and I'm hoping that we're going to find a way out of this, but you know that religion is in a general state of decline worldwide, not just in the United States. Even the Saudi kingdom is complaining about the rising number of atheists, even in a country where they can be killed for being atheist. Even there, they have a rise of atheism. So atheism is on the rise in the United States in every single state. Religion is in decline in every single state. Not just Christianity, all religions are in decline. Yet, simultaneously, we have a rise in religious extremism, creationism, flat earth, geocentrism. The same reason for all three. The people who want to say that who want to believe in a flat earth, they want to believe in it. They want to convince themselves the earth is flat. They refuse any evidence that it's not flat. The reasoning being that science can't explain a flat earth. And so through the God of the gaps fallacy, they think that justifies proof of God. If you can't explain it, therefore Jesus. And why is this happening? Why is there a rise in religious extremism? Because we have three statistics. Religion is decline. Atheism is on the rise. Religious extremism is on the rise. How can they all three be true at the same time? Pretty much right down the middle of the population, we have a huge polarization where people are walking away from religion entirely, which is fine. But at the same time, we have people walking away from science entirely. And they want to believe something that has no appeal to me at all, that they want to believe that they have a purpose, something that doesn't even make sense to me. I don't know what the disconnect is between people who think this way and the people who think the way that I do. I liken it to people who like football, because that's another mystery to me. Yeah, I just have the same problem. I would honestly, and this is not an exaggeration, I would rather watch the static between channels than watch a football game. But I know that people have this interest, and so for some people there's a great deal of appeal to believing that you're never going to die, that you have the ear of the most powerful being imaginable who can make 1 plus 2 equal 5 if the need ever arises, right? That you have connections to magical entities, whatever it is that these people want to imagine. I've had many people tell me, making admissions that, I'm Christian because I like to believe that, not because I think it's true. Or I believe because I have to. Or why can't I believe what I want to believe? My favorite one, my second favorite is, these may be what the facts are, but I prefer to believe this. So you prefer to believe something that's not true? Right? Or, and I forgot the one I was just about to list. There are many people that admit that they're going to believe what they want to believe regardless if it's true or not. That was the other thing. Why does it have to be true before I can believe it? Why the hell would you want to believe something that is not even probably true, nor even possibly true? I don't understand it. What value can there be in that? Because for me, the only value any information can have is however accurate you can show it to be, because then I would be able to use it. It doesn't matter what you believe. All that matters is why you believe it, because only that will determine whether I should believe it too. And if you believe it because of logical fallacies or because your misunderstanding of science or whatever, these are not good enough reasons. I need something to indicate that. One of my favorite interviews, a handful of people I've done this with, is people who used to be atheists, actual people, not like Kirk Cameron, who say they were card-carrying atheists, and people who never understood what an atheist was. But there's a handful of people that I can verify were atheist activists once upon a time and have since converted to Christianity. I love interviewing these people because their excuses are worse than the people that were born Christian and stayed that way. There's no logic. There's no reason. I talked to this one girl, for example, who said that she became a Christian because she looked at the evidence. And I pressed her, what evidence? Well, I just looked at the facts. What facts? What indicated that there was a God? We bounced around for 20 minutes on this. I felt like I was in the old Western where I'm shooting at the feet of the dancing person, because she's dodging everything. Finally, I get down to what the real reason was. She was in college. The guys at the Christian Coalition table, or whatever it is, a Campus Crusade for Christ table, they were hot. That justified her changing her religion. And I think I'm going to leave it with that. I want knowledge that enables me, that empowers me to be able to do things, to understand things. Misinformation is going to be deception. Lies and violence are in the same category to me. That if you're giving somebody information and it's wrong, and especially if it's deceptively wrong, but in any case, if you're giving information, if you're stating something as fact that is not a fact and pretending to know things you don't know, other people, and this is what all religion does, right? They just pretend to know things they don't know. That's what faith is. And people will make their decisions based on what you're telling them, based on your information. And so if your information is wrong, their decisions will be wrong. And so you are hurting these people, and it's especially bad when you're doing that to a classroom full of other people's kids, sequestered, susceptible students who are looking to you for an education. So it is ultimately immoral to be teaching things that are not the mainstream, that are the religious perspective or propaganda, rather than what we can establish to be true. And so I will leave you at that. Thank you. Thank you.